I'd like to welcome each one of you to our devotional study today. We are in Genesis chapter 20, and in Genesis chapter 20, an old sin of Abraham turns up, it reappears, and that is a sin of deceit, which Abraham had practiced back in Genesis chapter 12, I believe it was, and now we see it once again as we come into Genesis chapter 20. And we see in verses 3 through 7, the verses that we're going to learn today. Yesterday we learned of the lie that Abraham proclaims in saying that Sarah is his sister rather than declaring that she is his wife. Now we see in verses 3 through 7 how God intervenes for Abraham with Abimelech, and what would have happened or could have happened had not God intervened. So I want to read verses 3 through 7 today, and then we're going to look at those verses in the time that we have. So in Genesis chapter 20, verse 3, it says, "But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night, and said to him, Behold, thou art but a dead man for the woman which thou hast taken, for she is a man's wife. But Abimelech had not come near her, and he said, Lord, wilt thou slay also a righteous nation? Said he not unto me, She is my sister, and she herself said, He is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and innocency of my hands have I done this. And God said unto him in a dream, Yea, I know that thou didst in the integrity of thy heart, for I also withheld thee from sinning against me, therefore suffered I thee not to touch her. Now therefore restore the man his wife, for he is a prophet, and he shall pray for thee, and thou shalt live. And if thou restore her not, know thou that thou shalt surely die, thou and all that are thine." So as we come into these verses, we see how God intervenes for Abraham on with Abimelech, and the danger that would have been there had he not intervened. And as we come into these verses, what we see taking place here is a gracious God kept this deceitful act of Abraham and Sarah from resulting in disastrous deeds. God here intervenes and he reprimands Abimelech, which started the ball rolling toward this sin of deceit in the life of Abraham being confessed and being forsaken. And as we come into verse 3, we see that Abimelech is warned by God when he says there, God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said unto him, Behold, thou art but a dead man for the woman which thou hast taken, for she is a man's wife. So not only do we see that God gives instruction here to Abimelech, but he begins with the word behold to immediately and very quickly get his attention about the seriousness of what is being talked about here. And as we look at these verses, some would say, well, the punishment was pretty severe. And especially for somebody that didn't even really truly know what was going on as far as Sarah is concerned. But what we see here is that the penalty or the punishment that God dishes out to Abimelech, or says that Abimelech will receive here, this says plenty about the sinfulness of adultery. And this is something that people do not want to address in a day and age that we live in. But God reminds us here that adultery is wicked and that adultery will be dealt with. And in this verse, the lie of Abraham is revealed. He had told Abimelech, she's my sister, but that lie is revealed. And friends, all sin will be revealed sooner or later. God is omniscient. God sees all. God knows all. And he will expose sin whenever he chooses. It is so much better if believers will deal with their sin rather than come into the place that God has no option but to expose that sin and to reveal it from what it really is. And what we see in verses 4 through 6 is that we see that God providentially keeps Abimelech from adultery. And even though he was a Gentile, he called God Lord, and he seems to have been a very exceptional man from what we see of him revealed in these verses. Now, there's a number of observations from verses 4 through 6 that I'd like us to make today before we move on in these passages. First of all, what would have happened had God intervened? Certainly, if God had not intervened, Sarah could have lost her virtue in Abimelech's harem by being taken as one of Abimelech's wives. Now, as we come into verse 4, we see here that Abimelech's conduct was done, the Bible tells us in verse 5, in the integrity of his heart. And in verse 4, he makes it clear that he had not come near Sarah. So he felt, and rightly so, that he was not guilty of evil. Hence, the question about slaying the righteous that he says in verse 4. Notice what he says here. Abimelech had not come near her and said, Lord, wilt thou also slay a righteous nation? He's saying, I really haven't done anything wrong. I've just went again about along the line of what I've been told. And then in verse 5, it says, said he not unto me, she is my sister, and she herself said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and innocency of my hands have I done this. This verse, friends, is another illustration of the fact that sin causes others to be put in harm's way. Satan lies to us and says our sin affects nobody but us. But the truth of the matter is sin always puts not only ourselves, but also other people that are around us many times in harm's way as well. Then notice God's response to him in verse 6. God said unto him in a dream, Yea, I know that thou didst this in the integrity of thine heart, for I also withheld thee from sinning against me. Therefore suffered I thee not to touch her. God agrees with Abimelech here, and he exonerates him. The omniscience of God is a great comfort to the righteous, because it reminds us that God not only knows what's going on, but that he knows our motives, and that he's able to judge our actions by our intent in those. Notice it said in this verse, God says, I also withheld thee from sinning against me. He didn't say, I withheld thee from sinning against Abraham. He didn't say, I withheld thee from sinning against Sarah. He didn't say, I withheld thee from sinning against the Philistines. He says, I withheld thee from sinning against me. Friends, it's important for us to understand that primarily all sin is against God, and that is what makes sin so bad. David, in his psalm of confession in Psalm 54, when he had committed adultery with Bathsheba, he had committed murder against Uriah, he had sinned as being the king of Israel, but in Psalm 51:4, he says to God, against thee and thee only have I sinned, and done this evil in thy sight. Joseph, when he was tempted by Potiphar's wife in Genesis 39:9, said, how can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Friends, we need much more emphasis on this aspect of sin today, that we need to be aware of the fact that all of our sin is against God. And when we remember that ultimately sin is against God, it will help us much in this area of stopping our sin. And then here we see that God calls Abraham a prophet and orders Sarah restored in verse 7. Now therefore restore this man his wife, for he is a prophet, and he shall pray for thee, and thou shalt live. And if thou restore her not, know thou that thou shalt surely die, thou and all that are thine. Notice a couple of things in this verse. First of all, God did not call Sarah the sister of Abraham. He called Sarah the wife of Abraham. You know, we may change the labels on sin sometimes, and we try to make it sound like it's not so bad and make it a little more appealing, and we may change the labels and put good names on evil deeds, but God ignores our labels, and he still calls sin exactly what it is, and he still calls sin by name. Yet at the same time, as we come into this passage, we see here that God reveals to Abimelech that Abraham is a prophet. You know, many Christians today are like Abraham in that the way that they act, it nearly requires, that God tell others that they are a Christian, for no one would know otherwise based on the way that they live their life. Abimelech here was innocent in taking Sarah, but that innocence will cease if he refuses to give Sarah back to Abraham. And if that innocence ceases, death will be the punishment which God will bring upon Abraham. Friends, God is a holy God, and while he acts in grace, he will also bring judgment where grace is refused or where grace is misused. God sees his failing saints differently than the world sees them. Notice what it says in Numbers 23. In verse 21, it says, he hath not beheld iniquity in Jacob, neither hath he seen perverseness in Israel. The Lord his God is with him, and the shout of a king is among them. Friends, we need to understand that God sees us as righteous in our standing, but yet at the same time, we must understand that when we sin, that we need to confess that sin in order for our fellowship with God to be restored. Let me say this as we close. We are out of time, but he was putting Sarah in harm's way of being guilty of the sin of adultery, and adultery is a sin that is forbidden in the Word of God. It matters not whether you look at the Old Testament or the New Testament. The Bible clearly forbids adultery. There's only one place for sexual union, and that is within the bonds of marriage between a man and a woman. Just some verses that reveal this to us. Exodus chapter 20, verse 14. Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10. Matthew chapter 5, verse 7. Matthew chapter 19, verse 9. Romans chapter 7 and verse 3. 1 Corinthians 6, verse 9, and 2 Peter 2, 14 all show us that God forbids adultery and that it is a wicked sin that we must not partake in as believers. Have a great day.